Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer under the Spanish flag, remains a controversial figure in history. His voyages opened up the Americas to European colonization, changing world history. Once celebrated as a daring navigator, modern views often see him as a symbol of colonialism's impact on indigenous populations. Columbus's name is synonymous with exploration, yet his story is more nuanced than traditional narratives suggest. He was not the first to reach the Americas, which were already inhabited by thriving civilizations. His arrival marked the beginning of conquest, disease, and exploitation for indigenous peoples. Born in Genoa, Italy, in 1451, Christopher Columbus developed a fascination with the sea at a young age. He worked as a merchant sailor and mapmaker, absorbing knowledge of navigation and geography. These experiences fueled his ambition to explore uncharted waters and discover new trade routes. Columbus's interest in geography and exploration was further influenced by the prevailing intellectual currents of the time. The Renaissance period witnessed a renewed interest in classical learning and scientific inquiry. Columbus was captivated by the writings of ancient geographers like Ptolemy, whose works shaped his understanding of the world's dimensions. Columbus's belief that he could reach the east by sailing west was partly based on his miscalculations of the Earth's circumference. Driven by his ambition and his belief in his calculations, Columbus sought patronage from various European monarchs. He initially approached the Portuguese king, John II, who rejected his proposal. Undeterred, Columbus eventually secured the support of the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, after years of persistent lobbying. In 1492, Columbus embarked on his first voyage across the Atlantic, commanding the ships Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. After weeks at sea, the expedition landed on an island in the Bahamas, which Columbus named San Salvador. He believed he had reached the East Indies, and he called the indigenous people he encountered Indians. Columbus's first voyage opened the door to further exploration and colonization of the Americas. Despite his initial belief that he had reached the East Indies, Columbus eventually realized that he had encountered a new continent. Columbus's arrival in the Americas had a catastrophic impact on the indigenous populations. European diseases, such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, ravaged native communities, which had no immunity to these new illnesses. The Spanish conquistadors, following in Columbus's footsteps, engaged in brutal conquest and exploitation of the native inhabitants. They enslaved indigenous people, forced them to work in mines and plantations, and subjected them to violent repression. This systematic exploitation led to the decline of indigenous cultures and the loss of traditional ways of life. The introduction of new species of plants and animals, as well as the exploitation of natural resources, had a profound impact on the environment. The legacy of Columbus's voyages includes the forced displacement and dispossession of indigenous communities. Many native groups were driven from their ancestral lands, often through violence and coercion. Columbus's voyages had devastating consequences for the indigenous populations, but they also initiated the Columbian Exchange. This exchange involved plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Old World and the New World. New crops were introduced to both Europe and the Americas. Potatoes, tomatoes, corn, and tobacco became staple crops in Europe. European crops like wheat, rice, and sugarcane were introduced to the Americas. Horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep transformed agriculture and transportation in the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade forced millions of Africans to the Americas. This had a devastating impact on African societies and led to brutal chattel slavery in the New World. Christopher Columbus remains a controversial figure in history. While traditionally celebrated as a daring explorer who discovered a new world, modern perspectives often criticize him as a symbol of colonialism and its devastating consequences. Columbus's voyages undoubtedly opened up the Americas to European exploration and colonization. His discoveries led to the establishment of new trade routes, the exchange of goods and ideas, and the expansion of European empires. However, Columbus's legacy is also inextricably linked to the exploitation and oppression of indigenous populations. His arrival in the Americas marked the beginning of a period of conquest, disease, and forced labor that decimated native communities and disrupted their cultures. Evaluating Columbus's legacy requires acknowledging both his contributions to exploration and the devastating consequences of his actions. Understanding his complex legacy requires a critical examination of both the positive and negative aspects of his voyages and their lasting impact on the world.